lexical and semantic topics, and theories of lexical semantics, and many others. Just these are the main. So, do you hear that the titles are very special sometimes? Yeah? So, and you see, well, I like the titles, by the way, very much, and many things it does in linguistics. To my mind, he is not only has his own place in linguistics, a very significant place, but also he is philosopher of linguistics, and there are no other people like you, Dirk. So we're happy to see you here.
Yes, well, I'm happy to be here, so thank you. Thank you for being here. What I want to do in this course is not so very much talk about the lexicon. The lexicon is my main area of research, but the lexical studies have moved a bit in the direction of language variation studies in general. And so that's also what I will be talking about, but I will be doing that from the point of view of cognitive linguistics, which is a tradition of framework of linguistics that I've been involved with for a very long time. So what I want to do is to that's the first step we're going to take, to introduce cognitive sociolinguistics against the background of the history of linguistics. That's the history of mainstream linguistics in the West in the last 50, 60 years. No, the last 100 years. And then I want to illustrate how the typical features of cognitive linguistic approach can lead to specific contributions to variation studies, to studies of linguistic variation, or to sociolinguistics, if you wish. And so I have prepared 3 topics to talk about after the introduction. That's the study of meaning and categorization, the cognitive representation of variation, and the notion of system in a usage-based model. Okay, this is very abstract, maybe. So I want to introduce all of these things. I want to, as a first step, I want to show why these specific perspectives derive from the cognitive linguistic point of view. There are some references here, just a number of books and an article that use this title, this label of cognitive sociolinguistics. But this is just for your reference. Incidentally, I will leave the presentation here for anyone who would want to check things afterwards. Perhaps it's also useful to say a little bit about how we can interact in these courses. So I mentioned this in introduction, and then I have 3 specific topics. In principle, that would mean, so we have, in a sense, we have 4 lectures, more or less, of an hour and a half, somewhat less. In principle, that would mean just 1 specific step for each lecture, but it's not going to be that strict. So the timing will be more messy than that. And there's probably too much material to talk about anyway. So what I would like you to do is to interrupt me if there are things that do not belong to your background. And maybe the background is quite diverse. So I don't know exactly how to deal with that, and I don't know exactly what I can assume on your part. So if there are things that you would want me to explain a little bit more, just tell me. And I'm also saying state your preferences. At one point, I may ask you what precisely you want to hear, because I have a number of alternative case studies, let's say, that we could talk about. So maybe at one point you can decide what we're going to do. Now, so the first part, in principle, the first lecture, let's say the first part, is concerned with, that's the introductory part. And that deals with the question in very general terms, what does cognitive sociolinguistics do? Well, it combines a variationist perspective, the perspective of sociolinguistics, with the theoretical framework of cognitive linguistics. The question would then be, why would it want to do that, and what does it have to offer? And to explain what is going on there, I think it's useful to have a very brief look, a scandalously brief look, at the history of linguistics. And the history of linguistics, well, not really the history of linguistics, but the history of modern theories of language begins with the Saussure. And as you know, I mean, that's the general story. It's not true, but that's the way people talk about it. In terms of theory formation, what is quite important in the Saussure's approach is the distinction between langue and parole, between language as a system and parole as the individual activity based on that system. And very importantly, langue for the Saussure is a social thing. It's a set of conventions. Parole is individual activity. It's what people do. It's what we would now call language usage. These days in linguistic theory, people talk a lot about usage-based approaches. So that would be, if you think about it in structuralist terms, that would be putting the emphasis on parole. The tradition is different, because the tradition has always been, the tradition of the 20th century has been to put the emphasis on langue, on language as a system. Now this distinction, this dichotomy in the Saussure raises a question. What's the gap in the middle? There is a gap in the middle, because, and not just graphically. The gap in the middle is, or you can identify the gap in the middle if you ask the question, how do you get from langue to parole? There's a missing link. And the missing link is the individual's knowledge of the system. Because if you define the system as something social, as something that belongs to a group, let's say, and that even transcends a group in a certain sense. And on the other hand, parole is individual activity, then you implicitly assume that there is also individual knowledge of the system. That's probably so logical that the Saussure didn't mention it. But there is a question, of course, how do we conceive of that individual system? So if you take the next important step or important period in the history of 20th century linguistics, then of course you reach the stage of generative grammar, of Chomskyan grammar. And I would say that the crucial thing that Chomsky did was precisely to talk about language as individual knowledge. So and that's the Chomskyan distinction, which you probably also know, between competence and performance. And performance is like parole, that's usage of the system. Competence is knowledge that enables you to use language. But one important thing that Chomsky also did was to create another gap, because Chomsky had no interest at all in language as a social system. what is important from a Chomskyan point of view is just the knowledge of the language, the psychological thing, if you wish, or you could call it cognitive. By the way, why am I telling all this? Well, I want to show, and we'll see how it works in a moment. I want to show how these basic distinctions that you have, and these basic steps in the evolution of linguistic theories, lead to a shrinking of the idea of what linguistics is. That's what happens when people talk about autonomous syntax, autonomous of all the rest, as the core of the grammar. That's the major outcome of the Chomskyan approach. And that's very restrictive, and what we will see then as the next step is that restriction is being overcome. Now, a terminology that I tend to use to talk about this process is one of, and we'll see in a moment how it works, of decontextualization and then recontextualization. So the idea that people have of grammar, or had of grammar, was first being restricted and cut off from different types of context. But then a further movement, a reaction arose, and that's bringing in context. Again, bringing in context. And what I'm talking about as cognitive sociolinguistics is one way of achieving that recontextualization. It's part of that recontextualizing movement. That's why I'm going through this short history. Okay, so what's happening next with Chomsky? And when you see this system, this pattern, the question, of course, is what form does the linguistic system take? And in Chomsky's case, as we probably all know, you have this idea that you have to think of the individual knowledge of the language as something that is genetic and is given with our DNA. Now, why does that happen? If you try to analyze that conceptually, then you can see that it's part of a kind of a stepping stone argument. So you can say that the question here you could ask is, okay, if you forget about the social system, if you forget about the social aspects of language, where does knowledge of the language come from? If you take a social perspective, it's easy because you learn from other people. Specifically, you learn from caretakers when you're a child. Okay? That's a social perspective. And that is also what many people doing developmental language studies, studying language acquisition, are doing nowadays. They're trying to see how actual social interaction leads to language acquisition. But in a Chomskyan point of view, if you forget about language as a social phenomenon, where could knowledge of the language come from? Well, it would have to be genetic. That's the only other option. Once you realize that, then you can say, okay, if it's genetic, it's probably, the core of the language is probably not concerned with meaning and not concerned with the lexicon as the main repository of meaning. Because because meaning is not very likely to be genetically given. We know that meanings, concepts differ a lot across languages. So if you take a genetic perspective, if you're looking for universals, it's not very likely that the universals will be semantic. Okay. So if it's not semantic or lexicon, then the core of the genetic core of the grammar has to be syntactic. And it will be a formal syntax, not a syntax in which semantics plays a big role. And further, if the core of the language is about the formal syntax, the rule system, then the application of the rules is trivial. So, in the same way in which for the Saussure, parole was less important than langue, in the same way for Chomsky, performance is less important than competence. So if we reach that stage, if we see this internal logic, okay, once you forget about the social aspects of language, you get a logical restriction of the language, an almost logical restriction of the language, the formal syntax. So what's happened graphically, what's happening in Chomskyan grammar? No, let's take one step back. You would say, okay, this would be an ideal image of what language studies would be. You would have to take into account social aspects of language. You will have to take into account actual performance and mediating between the group effects on the one hand and the individual activity on the other hand is the grammar, and specifically also individual knowledge of the grammar. So ideally you would say a comprehensive view of the language would have to deal with these three things. What's happening in generative grammar, in Chomskyan grammar, is you throw away the social code, that's not important. You throw away performance, that's also not important. And you cut semantics off of the grammar. So that's the movement of Chomskyan grammar. Throwing away things as irrelevant, as not interesting, that do not belong to this idea of formal autonomous syntax. But now comes a very important next step. So if you think about the history of linguistics, you can say, in theoretical terms, if you follow this type of evolution that I'm sketching here, you have three main stages, okay? Structuralism, generativism, and then the post-generative cognitive and functional approaches that we have these days. But there's a fourth one between 2 and 3, an intermediate stage, because you can't just forget about all these things. So if you think about what happened in the 1970s, let's say, yeah, I know you're not old enough to think about what happened in the 1970s. If you look back at what happened in the 1970s, then you can see that these things were obviously not forgotten, but they were developed as independent approaches within linguistics. They did not really interact very clearly with the grammar in the Chomskyan sense. Because what you see, and that's really a historical process that you can see happening, let's say, from the late 1960s onwards, that is for instance, the emergence of sociolinguistics as a separate discipline, as a new and separate discipline. So if we think about what sociolinguistics, for instance, in the sense of Lebov and Trudgill and those people, when it came about, well, it came about in parallel with the restriction of the grammar. And it emerged as a separate discipline. Something similar for performance, because that's when you see the emergence of pragmatics as an approach. Everything that had to do with language use, but that was really separate from the description, what to some extent exaggerating quite a bit, but that was largely separate from the idea of an autonomous grammar. And for meaning, something similar was happening, because the 1960s, 70s is also the moment when you see the emergence of formal semantics. Formal semantics in the sense of logical semantics, okay, the study of logical properties of the language. So what you see in this intermediate phase is that these things that were thrown out by this narrow, decontextualized conception of grammar were being taken up again, but as separate disciplines. I think I'll try to show in a moment what. No, let me go to that at this point. Okay. the next step? The next step is then that we could see from the 1980s, roughly, we see the emergence of approaches to grammar that, in a sense, want to reintroduce all those separated aspects into the core description of what a grammar is, what a linguistic framework is. And that is what is happening in cognitive and functional approach, so-called cognitive and functional approaches. But interestingly, it happens in a number of steps. Up to a point, you could say that the various aspects that were separated are being reintroduced successively, gradually. So one of the first things to be reintroduced was meaning. If you think about what we call cognitive and functional approaches to meaning, to grammar, then basically what I try to do is to found the grammar, to describe the grammar from a conceptual point of view. Not formal syntax, but systems of categories, perspectives, construals. That's the Lanneker and Lakoff tradition, and there are many other names there. And there are many functional approaches as well. Crucial thing there is putting meaning, giving meaning, a central position in the language description. Okay? So that is an example of what I refer to as recontextualization. Not separating everything from the core syntax, but integrating as much as possible. And another approach there is paying more attention to the lexicon. That's what happens it actually also happens in generative grammar. Let's not go into that. But if you think of, how familiar are you with construction grammars? Well enough, they should be familiar.
Construction grammar?
Well, you know that one of the distinctive aspects of construction grammar is that you don't have a strict separation of the syntactic rules and the vocabulary, the lexicon.
Are there people who don't know the term construction grammar? Everybody, I think, knows.
Vaguely enough. Anyway, the point that's important for me here is that construction in a classical formal grammar, you would make a distinction between the syntactic rules and the lexicon, the vocabulary to which the rules apply. In a construction grammar, you don't have that distinction, because a construction can consist both of abstract elements like word classes and specific elements like lexical items, or classes of lexical items. So that is a typical way of introducing, in a sense, or reintroducing the lexicon as a legitimate part of the core grammar. And then, of course, you have this idea of what we call usage-based linguistics. I won't talk about what I put on top there, discourse and text linguistics. The usage-based approach, the usage-based models, that's very much a methodological development. That's the development where you say, okay, if we really want to see what's going on in the language, we have to look at the corpus data. We have to see how people actually use the language. And that's a reaction to the Chomskyan generative approach, where you basically just have to consider for yourself, is this a grammatical sentence or not? Right? the methodological basis of formal syntax in the Chomskyan sense is grammaticality judgments. When I take this sentence, does it belong to the language or not? Well, I speak the language, so I know whether it belongs to the language or not. Again, that's very restrictive, and people also notice that it often leads to conflicts. People are not so sure of what grammaticality actually is. So, taking into account actual language use is providing linguistics with another methodological basis. But it obviously means, in the entire picture that I'm drawing, that you are not reintroducing, that giving performance, language use, a crucial role in the development of the grammar. And then finally, of course, what you also want to do is to reintroduce, or to introduce the social aspects of language. And the social aspects of language as, well, we'll see in a moment that there are different levels at which you can do it, but in general, from a sociolinguistic point of view. Now, and then of course if you do that, then you get this notion that I mentioned of cognitive sociolinguistics. Cognitive sociolinguistics, you do all those things, all those steps belong to what we call cognitive linguistics, to the broad movement of cognitive linguistics and usage-based approaches to language. If you take the final step and also introduce a social perspective, then you reach the fields that I want to talk about, cognitive sociolinguistics. So that was the main step I wanted to explain, how cognitive sociolinguistics is part of a recontextualizing movement where you reintroduce all types of perspectives into the study of the language that were thrown out by formal syntax. Okay? Now you could ask yourself the question, does that make a lot of difference? Or wouldn't that just mean that you would do sociolinguistics in the traditional way? Well, the whole point is also that, well, one of the points is that precisely what we're trying to do here is to think of your grammatical structures from a social point of view. It's not just adding a social perspective, but it's putting it fairly centrally in the study of the language. So that would mean, if you think about, so the outcome in a sense, okay, the outcome would be something like a multidimensional grammar. That's not precisely what I will be talking about. I will be doing various case studies. But in a multidimensional grammar, the point would be that if you describe a certain pattern of the language, if you describe a construction, for instance, then all those elements could play a role in the description of that pattern. So that would mean, and that's something that people often do in approaches like, for instance, what is known as probabilistic grammar. What they do is to explain the presence of a certain, or the use, perhaps I should better say use, the use of a certain construction, a certain pattern, on the basis of, for instance, structural factors, semantic factors, discourse factors, and processing factors, psychological factors, and then maybe also socio-variational factors. I'm using the term lectal here, perhaps that's a term that needs some explanation. Lect is a schematic term that we use to talk about all types of language varieties. Okay, we have dialects, we have regiolects, we have sociolects, we have idiolects, we have still other varieties like registers, stylistic levels, and so on, and so on, and so on. We have national varieties of pluricentric languages. So all of these things are lects, and then of course the adjective is lectal. So again, the important thing is that what you see happening these days in usage-based approaches to language is that there is no restriction on the type of factors that could go into a description of the linguistic phenomena. So you have, let's say you have your linguistic forms, constructions maybe, or whatever. You have your linguistic forms, and all these contextual types of factors could go into the description of the form. That's in very broad terms, that's the recontextualizing movement that we see happening in linguistics these days, and that is a reaction, if you wish. That is the total opposite of this decontextualizing, throwing away of things that you could see in formal grammar. Okay? Can you believe me? Okay. Then the next step is, okay, but so, let's actually go back. If you take this perspective of the top left corner here, where I situated cognitive sociolinguistics, then the way I'm presenting it here is as a type of looking at grammatical structures and so on. The question could, of course, also be, yeah, but if you take this older tradition here, if you take sociolinguistics, what in the other direction does this cognitive sociolinguistic approach have to offer to sociolinguistics? So in a sense, once you see that this type of social perspective cannot be left to the side when you want an integrated form of an integrated type of language, of grammar, then of course you have to see the relationship in two directions, given the existence of traditional sociolinguistics, or traditional variations linguistics. What does a cognitive perspective, cognitive linguistic perspective have to offer social linguistics? Conversely, why is the social perspective so important for cognitive linguistics? Well, the latter question we've already answered in a sense. So one thing is, so in general, cognitive sociolinguistics combines the variationist perspective of sociolinguistics with the theoretical framework of cognitive linguistics. The theoretical framework is, without being too specific, precisely this recontextualizing, integrative approach that I illustrated, or that I sketched. Why do you want to do so? Well, attention for variation follows from the usage-based perspective, because if you look at what people actually do, you almost automatically find variation. And then second, a cognitive linguistic approach, a post-Chomskyan cognitive functional approach, is interested in meaning. That was the first step we were taking. But social variation of language is meaningful. It's part of the meaning of language. So, if you're interested in meaning, you have to introduce this. Social meaning is meaning, and if you want a meaning-based grammar, then you want to introduce or to include social meaning. More importantly, perhaps, what does it have to offer in the other direction? Well, now I have to be a bit more specific. I'll start with the final point. So notice that these are 3 points that I will then use as the background for the more specific case studies that we'll talk about, okay, for the next parts of the talk. But I'll take the last one first. The usage-based nature of variation. It's a usage-based model. We saw that. What does that mean for the idea we have of variation as such. And the question I want to deal with regard to that feature, that aspect, is okay. We started from this distinction between system and use, langue, parole. And so if you look at the history of the last 100 years, it's exactly 100 years, because the Cours de linguistique générale was published precisely 100 years ago. So if you look at the history of 100 years, then in a sense we've made full circle, or not full circle, we're going from one extreme to the other. We're moving from a situation in which the system was the thing to look at. The structure of the language in structuralist terms is the system. In generative terms, competence, the system of syntactic rules is important, not performance. Now we move to a usage-based approach. What consequences does that have for the way we can think about linguistic systems? Is there anything left of a linguistic system when we have a usage-based approach? Yeah, there probably will be, but there's a problem. So we'll deal with the question, how systematic is the linguistic system in a usage-based approach? And we'll see, or at least I hope that I'll be able to show that there are some, in a sense, some questions to be asked, some critical questions to be asked with regard to the traditional idea of a linguistic system, the system that we tend to work with, or the idea of the system that we tend to work with. I'm not sure how it is in your case, but my impression is that in most cases, very often, one of the basic things that young linguists learn is still this structuralist idea that language is a system in which everything hangs together. And that's the typical structuralist idea. A system of interrelated phenomena. Yeah, but precisely how interrelated are they? If you look at all the variation that is noticeable in language use. It's, for the time being, it's an open question, but so I want to come back to that. That's one of the things that we should talk about. And the other two aspects, so these are the three aspects of cognitive sociolinguistics that gave the title to this short course. The other two aspects have something to do with the notion of meaning, because as we saw, looking for a grammar that is based in meaning is crucial in this new stage. And meaning, in this case, I'm going to translate it, or I'm going to broaden it a little bit. I'm going to talk about it in terms of categorization. Okay? If you take the framework of cognitive linguistics, then it's meaning-based, but it's very much about how the world is categorized in language and language use. So one thing we will want to have a look at is variation of categorization. And that's going to be a major part of what I want to talk about, different ways of looking at categorization in language use from a variationist perspective. And notice, so again, like questioning, so in the third point, we are questioning the notion of system. In the first aspect, we are going to look at categorization and variation of categorization, and that is not a very traditional topic for sociolinguistics. Sociolinguistics is still predominantly about phonetic variation. Not only, but traditional sociolinguistics is very much concerned with sounds. Looking at variation of meaning, a variation of conceptual construal and things like that, that's a specific contribution that could come from this cognitive linguistic approach to sociolinguistics. And then a related approach is take the other perspective, so you have variation in categorization, variation of meaning, if you wish. But on the other hand, people also categorize linguistic variation as such. For instance, that's one of the things that we might talk about. We recognize, let's say, we classify people on the basis of their language. So what we are doing there is categorization of linguistic variation. So if you have a model like cognitive linguistics that claims that it has interesting things to say about the way in which language, interesting things to say about the way in which categorization works in language, then you can turn that around and then you can ask the question, okay, can we use those interesting things to say something more about the way people categorize language variation? So that's the final perspective, well, the third perspective. So the case studies that I'm going to look at, oh yeah, there's one more thing I need to say. So these are three specific aspects that I think follow from this framework. Okay, so I had this historical sketch, and I said we are now in a reintegrative stage. If we apply that to variation, language variation, what specific things can you do? Well, here are a few of the specific things. So one more thing I have to say is that if you look at language variation, you can do it at different levels. For instance, you can take a very general level and just talk philosophically about the social nature of language. That's not what I'm going to do. You can specify the perspective a little bit, and you can take a look at interlinguistic variation. What do languages do differently, or what do cultures do differently? That's a more typological perspective. That's also not the one that I will be taking. The most specific one is the one where you look at intralinguistic variation, variation within a specific language, and that's the perspective that I will take in the following steps. And then, so coming back to the three aspects that I mentioned, what I want to do then is to talk about onomasiological variation as an embodiment of this idea of variation of categorization. Who's familiar with the term onomasiology? No one? Just a few? Okay. I'll explain, of course. Then, categorization of variation. Oh, there's a typo here. That should have got the perception and not preception. That's where you look at perception and attitudes. I gave the example, you classify people on the basis of their language. That's a form of perception, and then very often that perception leads to an evaluation. And this approach, that's also something that I should not forget to mention. This is the approach that is most close to what people already do, or in some forms of sociolinguistics. So there is a thing, or an approach that is called perceptual dialectology. And that has precisely to do with, let's say, the cognitive representation of linguistic variation. And then the final thing that's, I already mentioned that, also that's then the question, what does it mean to have a system in a user-based? Okay, so that's the introduction. Background, by way of background and by way of introducing a number of things that we looked at. So, any questions at this point? Questions, remarks? No? I got a promise that it would be interactive. Maybe it's still too early.
Because Nico promised Dirk, so interactive.
No, everything more or less clear? Yeah? Okay. Let's go to another menu then. So I wanted to talk about, I mentioned that I wanted to talk about onomasiological variation. Coming to the terminology in a moment. And what I'm, this is also, I think I should say, this is probably the most, this is the most lexical part of